everyone, welcome to a new video on comparatives. This video is going to do three things. Number one, it's going to explain what is a comparative. Number two, it's going to show when to use comparatives. And ultimately, it's going to dive into the different ways and different scenarios of how you can use comparatives. With that said, firstly, what is a comparative? And in debating, a comparative is pretty much you just comparing two different arguments or scenarios or situations that like both sides have offered, and the whole aim is to show why one is better. And a common phrase that a lot of individuals use is on the comparative, which of the two is better and why. And that's something I've usually used in like my way of remembering comparatives, just the like phrase, which of the two is better and why. The second part of this video then is when do you use comparatives? And here's just a list of just like general times you can use comparatives. So when you're setting the debate up, when you're making an argument, when you're making individual responses or even large responses, when you're explaining your impacts, and a lot of really good debaters don't do this a lot, where they sometimes just, compare the analysis, the mechanisms, but never really the impacts, and ultimately, even when you're concluding a clash. But in general, though, you can use comparatives and in different ways at absolutely any opportunity that shows how you have won the debate. And the whole reason for this is because debates are won by showing which world, or why your world specifically, is better. With that said, how then do you specifically use comparatives when setting up the debate? There are a couple of things to note. The first thing is, when you're using a comparative to set up the debate, what you essentially are doing is establishing what both worlds or both sides of the house look like. Secondly, when do you do this? You do this in motions that either A, have direct comparison. So for instance, this house prefers X over Y. Or B, in motions that have a counterfactual. So for instance, in motions such as this house regrets, or motions that say this house prefers a world that looked like something or did something. Or ultimately, in other types of motions where both worlds are intuitive or they're easy to extrapolate. So for instance, in a motion that says this house would ban something, it would probably be intuitive that on your side of the house, you're banning that thing, and the other side of the house are probably in the status quo, where that thing wasn't banned at all. So with that said, the third thing to note is how then are you using the comparative when establishing what both worlds of the house, both sides of the debate look like? So the first thing is you're establishing what in isolation they are. Secondly, you're showing the similarities and differences on both sides of the house. And ultimately, what you're doing is that in not rare, but in a lot of scenarios, especially in counterfactual motions, you're justifying the comparatives also. So, for instance, you may be in a motion that says, this house regrets the glorification of soldiers. And on your side of the house, when you're on prop, you're like, instead of glorifying soldiers, we just respect them. And that is one counterfactual you could do in that motion. And what you're essentially trying to do is justifying why, on the comparative, that's what your side of the house would look like if it wasn't glorifying soldiers. But when you set up that comparative, you're like, on our side of the house, the counterfactual would be respecting soldiers. On the other side of the house, it's them glorifying soldiers. Then, with the first two things I say, you show what those two worlds look like, you show the similarities, the differences. A good example of showing differences and similarities also is an emotion that would be this house would force YouTube to remove all advertisements from emergency health videos. When you're doing the comparative, you could say on both sides of the house, we still have emergency health videos. On both sides of the house, we still have a lot of videos that you could get ad generation from. The only difference is that on our side of the house, emergency health videos specifically won't have ads on them. That's an effective way of setting up the debate. So Those are the three general things of when you're setting up the debate in terms of establishing a comparative. Why would you have to establish a comparative in setup? Firstly, because later on in your arguments, when you're doing argumentative comparatives, responsive comparatives, you essentially have to do that. And when you're doing that, you have to explain to the edge why your world is better than the other side's world or the situation or the scenario on the other side of the house. But in order to do that, you have to know what both sides of the house are doing. But also, it's important for doing other things in the debate, such as weighing, for example, when it's clear what both sides are arguing for, what both sides are defending, then it's easier to make the clear weigh ups in that regard. Now that you've made both worlds distinct, now you can dive into the more specific comparatives in your argumentation, in your impacting, in your clashes. So this part of the slide is just showing general tips on when you're doing comparatives. There are roughly four. The first thing is that you shouldn't confuse comparatives with weigh-ups. And the key difference between a weigh-up and a comparative when you're doing argumentation, for example, is that they need a level of congruency. What do I mean by that? I mean that when you're doing a comparative, you're comparing something on the same terms or basis of a comparison. So, for instance, in terms of an argument that says we create a safer space for this actor, the comparative isn't a separate benefit. Like instead of creating a safer space, you're giving people money on your side of the house. Under creating a safer space, why is it that on your side of the house, you're much better in that regard? So they need a level of congruency. And a good tip that I would give is that usually when you set up metrics in your debate, and a lot of teams do that in their first speech, in the first 2-3 minutes when they're setting up, after establishing the comparative, they explain to the adjudicators how the debate should be decided upon. And even if you're doing clashes again, that's a good metric to decide on. So if the clashes, or if that metric, I mean, teams sometimes use their metrics as clashes also. If it's like which side is better at creating a safer space, under that metric, under that basis, you can show why you're better. So that's the first thing to note. The second thing is that in order to effectively do comparatives, in order to make them super impactful, you have to show a direct comparison. So you're explaining maybe what are the two things that you're comparing. And usually, a lot of teams just leave it at mechanisms, at analysis, like, look, we're better at a safer space. But this is a bit of an advanced thing, but you can also do way ups within comparatives. So as long as it's under the congruency principle that I mentioned, right? So for instance, if you're talking about a safer space and both sides achieve that safe space, you can give a way up as to why under that direct comparison on your side of the house, the space is much more safer, for example. So that was the second thing. The third thing is that when you're doing comparatives, it's important to also do it per scenario. A lot of teams say, take them at their best case and take us at our worst. But there are also different scenarios where maybe you show why at both sides of the house, if you're both at your worst case scenario in terms of an impact, in terms of an argument, why you're still better. And usually these are the ones that you can do in argumentation, but they're usually scenario based. And it's always ideal to take another team at their best case scenario. So when you're doing a comparative, you may agree that the analysis is true. Now it's coming down to which side is best in terms of an impact. Ultimately, represent the other team's case fairly. So when you're taking them at their best, don't just show a weaker version of their case, because you are essentially just like trying to show why you're better, even if the team did all their work, because after all, debates are won on comparatives, as I've said earlier on. So those were general tips on doing comparatives. This part of the video is just explaining common metrics on doing comparatives. And the way this is going to be structured is per argument type. But again, don't be like confused. So if you're in a clash and it's dealing with a specific argument type, so a principal argument type or a practical argument type, you can still use these common metrics. So if we're dealing with a principal argument type, essentially the whole point of doing a comparative there is showing why your principle, or at least why your action, aligns mostly with the principle of the actor that you're arguing for, or what is the common principle that is being argued upon in the debate. So there are two scenarios. If you both agree on the same principle, let's say both sides of the house is arguing for equality as a principle, essentially you have to show why your principle, or at least why your actions or mechanisms in the debate, or even the world that you've established and set up, aligns with that principle much more than the other side of the house. If you're both arguing for different principles, let's say your side of the house is arguing for choice and autonomy, their side of the house is arguing for protection, for example, you have to show why your principle is more relevant, or at least aligns more with what the motion is asking for, or the most vulnerable actor in the motion. If you're dealing with the second argument type, which is a practical argument, and there are a couple of things you could do. You could show why either your mechanisms or your analysis achieves the outcome better than the other side, and usually a good strategy is showing it through all types of alternatives. So whether or not it's just the comparative you've established for them, or an agreed upon one, or other alternatives in the motion, you are essentially showing why you're better than the other alternatives. You could do this by showing why this maybe benefit is unique to your side. So for instance, if you're saying that we create a safe space, you can show why only a safe space would be created under you banning something, for example. Or if on their side of the house, they also achieve that outcome, you can show that they don't achieve it to the same extent as you. So for example, maybe you could say that opposition also have a safe space, but it's not as safe as ours because of X, Y, Z reasons. Maybe certain harms still exist on their side of the house. So those are just general ones. But if you want to do the thing that I mentioned earlier on in terms of way-ups, but still doing it under the principle of congruency, you just do what I just said. You just show why on their side of the house, maybe their benefit isn't as intense. Maybe their benefit isn't as good as yours, for example, even though you're agreeing upon the same thing. So those are comparatives and when to use them. I just want to note though, in general, you could use these common metrics even within your responses, even within your individual lines of analysis, even when you're showing why both sides of the house, maybe the strategy they got was wrong, why yours was maybe more in the spirit of the motion. So these are the common metrics. Thank you for popping by.